Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
Single best idea, a holiday shortened single best idea. Usually we keep it 6 minutes. We're going to try to do this in 5 minutes so you can get on with your 4th of July weekend. And to all of you worldwide, particularly in France and the United Kingdom, you just must be exhausted by the political debate. I can't imagine. Of course, everything that we had in Washington today. Thank you to Joe Matthew, Balance of Power, with Robert Costa of CBS. It was great to have Robert Costa and Joe Matthew together on all going on in Washington, and many, many other good guests today. When we invented surveillance and Bloomberg on the economy just a few years ago, don't look at me like that, Eric, just a few years ago, the basic idea was to engender a constructive debate where really smart people agree to disagree. We had that in spades yesterday in a strong 30 minutes with Lindsey Piegza of Stifel and Neil Dutta of Renaissance Macro. Lindsey Piegza believes inflation is more persistent if declining a bit. She suggests the Fed will take its time even into 2025.
I think the Fed's on the sideline through the end of the year.
Wow.
I think there's no motivation for the Fed to rush, given the fact that we saw an extreme amount of head fakes at the start of the year with 3 months of acceleration. And even when we strip out a lot of that noise and we look at core services, excluding housing, so a measure the Fed calls the super core, we're talking double that 2% intended target. So a number of key metrics are still saying there's not enough indications that we're on a sustainable path to 2%.
Okay.
So we need that ongoing message of patience reinforced by Fed officials so we don't see them get ahead of themselves as they did at the start of the year.
I'm going to editorialize Lindsey Piegza Stifel. That's a lonely outpost. I'm sure there's people that agree with her out there, and I don't have them in front of me right now. But boy, is that against a consensus call. Consensus call has been some form of vector of disinflation. Ellen Zettner and her team published an hour ago at Morgan Stanley and say disinflation is in place. And there'll be many other people. I think you're going to see a ton of publications over this 4th of July weekend with all that's going on in Washington. And, of course, the French results. I should say, look to Alan Katz and our Paris News Bureau, Caroline Conan and others for very, very good coverage of the French election. We will do that on Bloomberg on Sunday. But within the turmoil and all this, there is this sense, and it is consensus, that we're getting there. And maybe as the cliche is the last mile, it may be hard to get to 2.0%. Neil Dutta has been an optimist, but when the facts change, Neil Dutta changes. And it's not that he's calling for disinflation. He said there's just been a shift out there where the Fed has to get out in front of the data. Here's Neil Dutta, Renaissance Macro.
The story for the year is that the trade-offs are shifting. Last year it was all about inflationary boom-like dynamics. There's just simply no way the Fed should or could even think about cutting in that environment. But this year, things have changed. Ultimately the economy is growing, maybe 2% for the first half of the year. If you look at total hours worked over the last 6 months, it rose about 1%. So if you assume around 1% productivity growth, you're looking at about a 2% economy. And I think what's important is that the unemployment rate is rising. So even though we've been growing 2%, it hasn't been enough to keep the unemployment rate from going up. And that means you're basically growing below potential. And at the same time, the momentum for inflation is lower, right? I mean, we're seeing that come out in the data. It's about balance of risk. Tell me, what is the right tail for GDP growth? It's really hard to come up with. The unemployment has already been rising. That means the risk is that it keeps rising.
Right. Dutta, going back to economic growth, I really can't say this enough. Most economists looking at inflation-adjusted growth. The U.S. calculates it in a different way than they do in Europe. It gets very confusing. But this whole debate about 2% real GDP growth being below that, which is sort of where everybody is now, including Atlanta GDP, is a guesstimate. Or does it surprise once again to a more robust economic growth is maybe part of the debate into Q3 of this year. It is an extraordinary weekend. Look to our Washington News Bureau, Balance of Power, Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lines, and others, a vast team here looking at all that's going on with the Biden administration, with Mr. Trump as a presumptive Republican candidate, and others in Washington. Again, in London, the pageantry. Thank you to Tom McKenzie for being outside 10 Downing Street today as we minted a new prime minister, his greeting with the King of England. And I don't think I've said this yet. Prime Minister Starmer. I've got to get used to that. But that's where we are. And then we go to the French elections this weekend to try to stagger into a holiday normal work week next week. We are on YouTube. Search and find Bloomberg Podcasts on YouTube. You go YouTube Bloomberg Podcasts. It's out there on Google. Apple CarPlay with 20 nations. Good morning to the United Kingdom. 20 nations have Apple CarPlay. Android Auto as well. And of course on Apple Podcasts, this is single best idea.